In this clip, we will cover attack helicopter operations. The scenario instructions may specify that a player starts with a certain number of attack helicopter steps, one or more specific helicopter types. These steps are always assembled under a helicopter unit of the appropriate type and placed in the ready box, which we can see here, located on a player's helicopter track found on his tracks card. And here we're looking at the NATO tracks card. So for instance, if the scenario instructions indicate that at the start of the game the NATO player receives 6 steps of AH-1 attack helicopters, then he would deploy a unit with 6 steps into the ready box on the helicopter track. The scenario instructions may also specify that a certain number of attack helicopter steps of a specific type will appear as reinforcements on a certain game turn. So, for instance, the scenario instructions may indicate that the NATO player receives 3 steps of PAH-1s, and these 3 steps of PAH-1s are then also deployed into the ready box on the NATO player's helicopter track. Note the back of each attack helicopter unit shows 2 sets of values. One set of values with a range of 2 are the standoff values, and another set of values with a range of 1 constitute the gunnery values. An attack helicopter unit always uses its standoff values when 2 hexes away from an enemy unit, and its gunnery values when it is adjacent or in the same hex as an enemy unit. When a player brings an attack helicopter unit onto the map, it has a very specific limit on the number of steps that it contains. This limit never applies to units while they are on the helicopter track. This means that a player is always free to consolidate the steps of the same type of helicopter unit under a single unit counter when those steps are located in the same box on the helicopter track. But he cannot, obviously, consolidate steps of different helicopter types. An attack helicopter unit is always brought onto the map in response to a fire call made by an HQ in its chain of command. For NATO only, there is an additional restriction that an attack helicopter unit can only be called by an HQ of the same nationality. So this AH-1 unit here can only be called by a U.S. headquarters unit, and this West German PAH-1 unit here can only be called by a West German HQ unit. The game you are playing will tell you which formations are in the chain of command for a specific helicopter unit. There are 2 additional restrictions. The calling headquarters must make an Army call, not an air call, and the friendly fire support chart must allow an attack helicopter unit to be called for the type of fire that is being conducted. So, for instance, looking at the NATO fire support chart, we see that an attack helicopter unit is allowed to participate if the NATO player is making a fire strike, but not if he's making any other type of strike. No attack helicopter unit can participate in any form of fire during a hasty attack operation. As you see, that's a blank line. However, one attack helicopter unit is allowed to participate in both the offensive fire step and the defensive fire step of an assault operation. So we see that 1 battalion is allowed for assaults. If we were to look at the Warsaw Pact fire support chart, we would see identical restrictions, except that a Warsaw Pact attack helicopter unit can never participate in defensive fire, period. That is the privilege of a NATO attack helicopter unit. For an attack helicopter unit brought onto the map, it is important to note that it cannot be bigger than a NATO battalion or a Pact regiment. A player may have a lot more steps available in his ready box, but he cannot bring a unit onto the map larger than a NATO battalion or a Pact regiment. The number of steps for a battalion or regiment varies by helicopter type. PAH-1 units of the West German Army and AH-64 units of the U.S. Army can never have more than 3 steps when they enter the map. AH-1 units from the U.S. generally can have no more than 4 steps, although as an exception, the AH-1 unit belonging to the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment in the 5th Corps game can have 5 steps. Finally, a Warsaw Pact Mi-24 Hind unit can never have more than 6 steps. All of these limits are found on a player's fire support chart. Let's look at an example. The Soviet Guards Motor Rifle Division has activated, and the 117th Motor Rifle Regiment is executing an assault operation against the M1 unit in this objective here. It is the defensive fire call step of the operation. The NATO player has already fired his local artillery unit here in support of the defense by the Bradley against the operation of the 172nd Guards, which means that it is fired and not available to support the M1 unit that is defending in this objective X against this Soviet assault. However, because the current Pact operation is an assault, the NATO player is eligible to make an Army call for up to a battalion of attack helicopters. Looking at his ready box, the NATO player sees that he has 6 steps of AH-1s and 3 steps of PAH-1s. Since a U.S. unit is being attacked, a U.S. headquarters will have to make the fire call, and therefore it can't call the West German PAH-1 unit. The NATO player could bring on as many as 4 AH-1 steps, which is the limit for an AH-1 battalion, but in this case he decides to call for a 3-step unit to keep more firepower in reserve. So the NATO player now brings in a spare counter, moves 3 steps underneath it, and leaves 3 steps on the track. And he will now enter this 3-step AH-1 unit from the map edge. During the NATO defensive helicopter movement step, the NATO player enters his attack helicopter unit as called from the friendly map edge, and he can move it an unlimited number of hexes across the map until he gets within 2 hexes of an enemy unit. So in this case, the NATO player wants to help the M1 unit with its defensive fire, so he moves this unit across the board until it is within 2 hexes of an enemy unit. Not necessarily within 2 hexes of its target. It may take flak fire en route to a hex from which it can reach its target. As soon as the unit is within 2 hex range of an enemy unit, it is rotated to its standoff side. The next thing that occurs is that the Warsaw Pact player gets a chance to fire flak, because this helicopter unit is now closed to the 2 hex flak range. The Warsaw Pact player refers to the flak strength chart and sees that at a 2 hex range, each of his steps will project a flak strength of 1/3. He next determines that he has 3 steps here, and that he has 4 steps here, both of which are within the 2 hex range to go shoot at our attack helicopter. That's a total of 7 steps at 1/3 of a flak strength per step, so it is 7/3, which rounds down to 2, so the Warsaw Pact player has a flak strength of 2. He refers to the anti-aircraft table, rolls a die of 4, adds the flak strength of 2 to this die roll to produce a modified die roll of 6, and the anti-aircraft table tells him that a 6 misses. So that means that this AH-1 unit has survived enemy flak fire in this hex. Now, having received that fire, the NATO player could move 1 more hex to get closer, which would allow him to increase his attack value, because he's now close enough to use the 20mm cannons that these AH-1 Cobras carry. However, that would expose him to a lot more flak. This unit here would be projecting 3 flak points all by itself, and he would be subject to an additional flak point here, and a flak point here, and a flak point here, for a grand total of 6 flak points, and the NATO player realizes that adding 6 to the die roll is probably a bad idea, so he does not do that. He remains in this hex, and he declares that this hex will be his firing position. So that ends his movement, and we now move to the actual defensive fire step. The NATO player chooses to combine the fire of his attack helicopter unit and his tank unit against this BMP unit. Here, the H-1 unit fires with an attack strength that is equal to its printed strength of 4 times the number of steps that it contains, or 12. The tank unit here fires with a printed attack strength of 9 times 1 step, or 9. Neither of these units have any modifications to their fire, given that they're both shooting into a clear terrain hex, so this attack is a straight 9 plus 12, or 21. After the standard division by 2, that becomes a 10. So we have an effective fire strength of 10 against this unit here. The NATO player goes to the CRT. He rolls a die. The die is a 6. That produces a hit modifier of 0. That means that the number of hits inflicted is a straight up 10. The Warsaw Pact player has a defense strength of 3 in this hex with no modifications because it is in a clear terrain hex. It must absorb 9 hits by losing each of its 3 steps, leaving 1 hit unabsorbed because the unit is now dead. That ends this defensive fire. The Warsaw Pact player would now go on to his offensive fire step, and then at the end of the operation, during the completion step, this attack helicopter is withdrawn from the map. It flies off a friendly map edge. It is then removed from the map and placed on the recovery box on the helicopter track. During the reorganization phase at the end of the current turn, all helicopter units on the helicopter track are moved up 1 box, unless they are in the ready box already. During the reorganization phase of the next turn, it would move up yet another box, allowing it to consolidate here, and there would then be a total of 6 steps again in the ready box on the helicopter track. And this cycle means that a helicopter unit can fly onto the map at most once every other turn. It is important to note that helicopter units cannot fly during a night or fog game turn, with the sole exception of US AH-64 units, which had thermal imaging systems that allowed them to fly at night, but not in fog. And this concludes our clip on attack helicopter units.